Hey guys, Scott Wiggins here. I run a website called therecordingsolution.com where I help people make better recordings and mixes inside their home studio. But right now I'm shooting some exclusive content for Bedroom Producers blog. And I want to start out with a EQ series because I think EQ is one of the most important tools in your arsenal. And the reason I think EQ is so important is because it is what allows you to carve pockets for everything to sit in. So when you think about mixing music and tracks, there's only so many areas in the frequency spectrum that instruments can live. And so your job as a mixer is to carve pockets for each little space for every track for it to live in harmony with the other tracks so you can hear everything clearly. And if you can't get that right in the beginning, then your mix is going to have trouble all the way to the end. That's where you get the muddy mixes and you can't hear instruments the way you'd like to, no matter how much you turn them up. So that's why I think EQ is the most important piece in your mixing arsenal. And so I wanted to start off with that. So we're going to do the basics first. So this video is just going to be touching on the way I think about EQ and the controls and all the knobs. So if you've never really been introduced to EQ, then you're going to get a rundown of what all the knobs do. And once you understand how one EQ works, parametric EQ, by the way, with like the multiple bands. Once you understand how one of those works, then you can pull up any EQ, and as long as you find your way around the knobs, then you'll know how to work every EQ and you won't be as intimidated. So the way I like to think about EQ, and I've heard it explained multiple ways from different mentors of mine, and you'll hear it explained different ways, but I've heard it as smart volume knobs. I've heard it as painting pictures with like painting colors with EQ and sound, and being like surgical, like a surgeon's knife, or a painter adding strokes, or a sculptor cutting things away. But you're just dealing with volume, and the broad strokes of volume are obviously done on a track-by-track basis with these faders. So you can either turn something up or turn something down, and that's where I would want you to start when you're starting a mix for the first time. Before you do any EQ or add any plugins, you want to do something called a static mix or a initial mix, a gut mix, I've heard it called. And you just go fader by fader and you mess around with panning and volume positions, either up or down, and just get a good balance without any plugins at all. And so that'll put you in the very best spot possible. So if you can get the song grooving with just the faders and pan knobs, then that's a good place to stop and then start adding your EQ and things like that. So once you get the faders where you think they sound good, and say you're working on a track like this piano right here, if you couldn't hear it, instead of trying to add EQ and compression, then add a broad EQ stroke, which just would be volume. You could just turn it up. Now, if you get to a point where you're turning it up and you're still not hearing it the way you want, it's not cutting through the mix when everything else is in, then that's when you know you need to add some EQ, because that's a EQ masking problem. It's when frequencies overlap each other and they cancel each other out. I'm not going to get too technical, but if you have all these instruments occupying the same frequencies, they're going to cancel each other out. It's going to get muddy. So that's when you would know you need to add an EQ plugin and start sculpting and painting a little bit there. Before I even pull up an EQ, you'll see these trim plugins. And the only thing I have on this whole song, this whole mix here, is just EQ plugins. And then I have some trim plugins because this song has some instruments that were recorded too loud. And so all I did before the EQ was put on a trim plugin in Pro Tools. It's just like you can add volume or subtract volume. And I just put like -10 dBs across the tracks that were recorded too hot, because just like you've probably heard if you're new to mixing, or if you haven't heard, you don't want to record things too hot. You don't want to mix things to where, like, here's my master fader and here's 0. You don't want to have all these tracks, which are mine, are now routed into this master track. They're all dumping, every track here is dumping into my master fader. So I have a master volume control, master pan, everything. You don't want to start mixing and start getting the levels, once they're all dumping in here, to start hitting 0, because you'll start clipping. And even on a track by track basis, you don't want to get too close to clipping, because clipping in digital world is bad. It's not a healthy, it's not a nice sounding distortion. It's just digital and it's gross. So just like you would on a faders, you wouldn't want to get close to clipping. You also don't want to get close to clipping inside your plugins. So that's where I want to start with this EQ. This is a stock EQ in Pro Tools, and most EQs should have an input and output metering of their levels. If not, you should try to put your tracks up a plugin that does, so you can see where those are sitting. And just like on a fader, when I'm recording, I would want to keep the meters, if it's dBFS on the faders, full scale FS, dBFS meaning full scale, not getting too technical, but you would want to keep the meters when you're recording around -10, -16, -18 area. You don't want to get anywhere close to 0 while you're recording, and also when you're bringing in plugins, because you start clipping inside your plugins, and so you might not be clipping on your fader, but then you're hearing all this distortion, and you keep adding more tracks, and you're adding more plugins, and you start getting lost, and you don't even know where you're getting the distortion, and it could be inside your plugin. So when you pull up the EQ, you want to see where those levels are. So let me solo this instrument, this piano, and play it for you there. That's the Wurlitzer, I'm sorry. You see the levels here? And then when it gets to a harder part, a louder part, it's just staying around -10. That's a good healthy range for the levels of the input and output of my EQ. Now if I took this trim plugin off, it's just taking about 10 dBs off, you'll see what I'm talking about and where the levels are inside this EQ. See how we're getting too hot here? Now, I may not be clipping, but you got to think about what we talked about. EQ is just volume faders, individual volume faders. So right now, this is a 7-band EQ, meaning here's 1 band, 2 bands, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So you have individual, precise, like magnified volume knobs for that one instrument. So instead of turning it up broadly with your faders, you can go in here and get surgical. So if you're already close to clipping up here in your plugins, and then you start adding, say you start boosting, let's do this guy right here. Say you start adding some high mid-range frequencies, well then you're gonna start clipping. I'm gonna get dramatic. It's not clipping there, but you're getting close to it. And if you started doing that on track by track basis, you wouldn't end up clipping there if you're adding too much volume. So just be conscious of keeping these input and output levels conservative. So that's the first 2 knobs you will see here. And then let's go over, I'm gonna pull up an EQ that I haven't messed with already. So you have your input and output controls. Right here is the phase button. If you see a circle with a line through it, most plugins will have this, and that's to check the phase of your instruments. For instance, say you had a snare track and you had a top and bottom snare. You had the top of the snare mic'd, and then you had the bottom of the snare mic'd. Well, the waveforms are gonna hit those mics at different times, and one might be going up, and one might be going down from the same sound source. And if you start blending the top and bottom snare together, well, those waveforms aren't in line, and they could cancel each other out. You could lose the tone of your snare. So that would be a button where you could flip the phase of one of the snares, either the top or the bottom, and then you would hear immediately the tone of your snare come back, because you're literally just flipping the phase of one, so it flips the waveform, and then it lines it up with each other. So that's one example of why you would use that button. And then let's go back to this EQ over here. So we got the input and output knobs, the phase button, and then you have a high pass and low pass filter. So what a high pass filter does, I'm gonna turn it on, and you'll see how it dipped right there. And you can set the slope. So right now it's 6 dBs per octave, meaning it's gonna slope down 6 dBs per octave as it goes down, and it gets steeper, 12 dBs per octave. It's 18 and then 24. So it's just the steepness, if that's a word, of the slope. So what this does is high pass filter. It lets everything above the frequency knob right here, the frequency you set it at, this just points to the frequency. So right now we're at 103.9 hertz. So if I left it there, high pass filter means it would filter out all the low end below 103. Everything below it would be cut out. You wouldn't hear it, and it would let all the frequencies above it pass. Now, where you would use that would be examples of anything that's an instrument that's not bass heavy, that's not supposed to be filling out the bass role in a mix. So typically your kick and your bass guitar will occupy that low end. So if you have your vocal and acoustic guitar, you would slap an EQ on your vocal or acoustic, and you would roll off these low frequencies. And a good trick is to roll them off until you hear the tone of the instrument you're rolling off start changing, and then roll it back a little bit. And then when you would kick this in and off, you wouldn't really hear a difference, a really big noticeable difference in the sound of that instrument, but you did know that you cut out all these low frequencies. Even though you might not hear it easily, they are there, and they are adding to that space in the low end that your kick and your bass need to occupy. And it's not necessary to have every instrument occupy that low end. So you could clean up some of that low end, and that will let your kick and your bass sit a little better inside your mix, because it's not having to compete. Remember how we said if you have everything occupying the same frequencies, they're going to be competing with each other, and it's not necessary. So you could clean out a lot of the low end on pretty much every track except for your bass tracks that you have to pick when you start mixing what instrument or what track you want to occupy that bass area. So kick, bass guitar, maybe be a lead synth or something, whatever kind of music you're playing. So that's an example of why you would use a high pass filter. And then on the other end is a low pass filter. And that does exactly the same thing as high pass, just on the other side. So wherever frequency you set it at, so right now it's at 3.1 kilohertz, it's going to let everything below that pass and cut out all the high frequencies above where you have it, where the grayed out area is. Now, an example where you would use that will be kind of like on reverbs or delays. So say you have your lead vocal up, you would want to add a reverb or delay to add some space and depth, but you wouldn't want those reverbs or delays to compete with the lead vocal. You just kind of want it in the background to add a little effect. So you could roll off those high frequencies in the reverbs and delays, just kind of have them sit in the back and be like more of a supporting role. So that's one example where you could use a high pass filter. So those are the first two bands. Now let's get to the low frequency band, low mids, mid frequencies, high mids, and the high frequency band. So that's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now, every one of these knobs do the same thing on a band by band basis. So if you can understand one of these, then you'll understand all of them. So if you pull up an EQ, don't be intimidated by all the knobs. Just know if you understand one band and what these knobs do, then you're going to be good. So let's start off with the frequency knobs. So if you look right here, this low frequency band is in red, so you'll see the red dot. So what this frequency knob does, if you see it when I move it, it just kind of moves it across the line, and we're dealing with 20 hertz, which is super low, all the way up to 20 kilohertz, which is super high. So we're operating in the low band. So that's just pointing to the frequency that I want to affect. So I'm not doing anything to the sound. I'm not affecting any of the sound quality of that track. I'm just trying to figure out where the frequency is. And then this knob is the gain knob, and that would either boost or subtract the volume of that one band, that frequency. Now right now we're set to a shelf, which is this button, or you can make it like a bell curve, like a notch curve. So that would be more pinpointed frequencies, and this would be a shelf, and a shelf meaning, as you can see by the visual graphic here, you're boosting everything below 68 hertz right now. It's going to boost everything at 68 hertz and then below it. So you would, like a whole shelf on the low end would be boosted. And you have shelves on either end. You have shelves on the high end and the low end. So you can either boost or subtract. Okay. And then if you wanted the notch get more surgical, you can do the notch. And then the way you get a wider notch or a tighter notch is with what they call a Q. Now a Q, I don't know what that. I've heard the name. I've heard it told to me. I always forget, but it doesn't really matter. Just know that it makes the boost or cuts you do with EQ either makes them wide. See, I'm moving this Q knob, or it makes them super narrow. So that's all a Q does. It's just how wide you want the boost or cut, or how narrow you want the boost or cut. Okay. And then say once you've found the frequency that you like and maybe you want to boost or maybe you want to cut, you would either do it with this knob, the frequency knob, or you can drag it and drop, or drag it like for this one, and then you can pull it out with your mouse, or you can use the knobs to do the same thing. Okay. So that's all we're doing. And that's on a track by track basis. So just think of these as volume knobs. That's it. It's not complicated. There's no reason to overthink it. And the reason why you would want to pinpoint volume knobs, and we'll get into that a little later in the next videos with subtractive and additive EQ, is because you're trying, like I said, to carve out the pockets for every little instrument to poke out and be heard. Now that we've had a run through of all the controls, I want to pull up a couple more EQs so you can see that they're pretty much all the same and you don't need to be intimidated by them. So let's get this guy. Let's go to my EQ folder, and this is another stock plugin. It's a channel strip from Pro Tools, meaning it has a compressor, an EQ, everything built in. But I just want to look at this EQ down here, and it has the same thing. So if you can figure out where everything is, so right now I know this is your filters, your high pass filters. So you're seeing the different areas and the different ways, the different notches you can do. So that would be a high pass filter. So I can just drag this and you can see it, and you can even do it with this knob. And then here's your slope to see how steep your slope would be. So that's the same thing as we did over here. High pass, high pass. And then you have your each individual knob. So you could click on that and the screen changes. Now you have your frequency, your gain, your types of shelves you would want to do, or notches, bell curve. And then here's your Q to tighten it up. It's the same thing on a band by band basis. So you have your low frequencies, your low mids, high frequencies, and your two filters. Same thing. Let's pull up another EQ. Let's pull open a EQ that does not have a visual aspect to it. And that actually might be better, because a lot of times we start mixing and EQing with our eyes when we look at those graphics. So it's the same thing. You have bands. So these are your high pass and low pass filters. So where you set it at on the high pass, it's going to cut everything out below that. Same thing on the high pass. Low frequencies, low mids, high mids, same thing. These just point to specific frequencies, and you either boost or cut. Same thing. And these might be better for you and healthier for you if you close your eyes and you mix with your ears, which a lot of us, including myself, need to start getting better at, because a lot of times you get caught up in those graphic EQs and you'll do like a major boost or a cut, and you might be watching blogs or YouTube videos and they're like, don't cut that much or don't boost that much. And yes, there's some foundational rules of EQ not to do and things that don't, but really it's, if it sounds good, then it's right. Okay. So this helps you get away from the visual aspect that maybe you wouldn't have boosted that much or cut that much. You liked the way it sounded and it fit in the mix, but for some reason you didn't like the way it looked and you backed off it, or you didn't go as extreme, and you might have hurt your mix. So I'm not saying to go crazy and boosting 24 dBs or whatever on everything and cutting out everything, but I'm saying are circumstances where you might need to go a little crazy, and this could help you mix with your ears instead of your eyes. So this is just setting the frequencies, and this is setting the dB boost or cut. Now there's not really a Q on this one, so you can't really maneuver how tight or wide your EQ boost and cuts are, but you have different EQs that I believe this. Here's another EQ. Now this one does have a Q, you see, on this band. It's the same thing. So once you know how to work an EQ, you should know how to work any EQ. And I don't want you to be intimidated. So now that we've gone over the knobs, I just wanted to explain to you how everything worked. In the next video, I want to get into what we call subtractive EQ, and I'll explain to you what I mean. But obviously, it's about taking away frequencies instead of boosting frequencies. And I want you to watch the next video, and I want to explain to you in the long run in a mix why cutting frequency, subtractive EQ, could be more natural and a more musical sounding mix than a bunch of boosts. So stay tuned for the next video. Scott Wiggins from therecordingsolution.com, exclusive right here on Bedroom Producers Blog. We'll see you in the next video. Thanks for watching.